Hi, everybody. My name is Wendy Lokanc-Diluzio. Welcome to Nursing 5100, Ethics, Policy, and Practice. Have you ever been faced with an ethical dilemma in your workplace? How did you feel? What strategies did you use to resolve the issue? Were you satisfied with how it was resolved? I would imagine that most, if not all of you, have been faced with an ethical dilemma in your workplace at some point in time. For some of you, the issue might have caused you a lot of angst and worry. You might still be trying to work through the issue to make sense of it. Others might have had an easier time working through their issue. However the issue went for you, it's probably accurate to say that you learned something about yourself, your profession, the people you serve, and the people you work with. You might also agree with me that even in situations where the dilemma was satisfactorily resolved, there is still more to learn and do to ensure that all dilemmas have a satisfactory outcome. This course is intended to help you develop greater understanding of ethical frameworks that might be used to guide your deliberations, as well as learn to apply a particular strategy in working through an ethical dilemma. So let's start. It's accurate to say that when faced with an ethical dilemma, simply following one's gut is inappropriate and unprofessional. Certainly our professional code of ethics would agree with this statement. So then how do we approach ethical decision making? This course will include a variety of ethical frameworks and an ethical critical reasoning decision making model. Case studies and discussion will be the primary teaching route. Throughout the course, there may be activities that you can choose to complete or not. These activities are intended to support your formative development and so are not considered in the calculation of the final grade. Next week, we will be going through the course outline and the assignments. This week, the focus is on the importance of ethics. So what is ethics? We make decisions every day based on what we think is right or wrong. So what we ought to do versus what we ought not to do. So if a sales clerk gives us back too much money, should we return the extra? Do I give my spare change to the panhandler or do I not? People can and do have varying ideas about what should be done in these two circumstances. I want you to think for a minute, what would you do? Sometimes the response is clear and sometimes it's not as clear. Making decisions based on our understandings and our values is what the heart of ethics is. What ethics tries to do is explore how people come to the values that guide their actions. It tries to deconstruct where our understanding of good comes from. It tries to identify patterns of reasoning and which decision is the right decision. The term ethics and morality will be used interchangeably throughout this course. What makes an issue an ethical dilemma? Ethics are rules of behavior produced by moral thinking and may be either formal or informal rules of actions. Laws are enforced rules under which society is governed. Laws maintain order in all aspects of our lives, provide solutions that can help resolve conflicts, bring about social change and change in behaviors and norms, outline civil rights of individuals and protect those rights, reflect and express social norms and expectations for individuals, groups, and organizations. And of course, there's penalties for people who violate laws. Laws reflect popular belief about the rightness or wrongness of particular acts, and laws are an attempt to codify ethics. Ethics can also inform policy. Policy is set by organizations and professional bodies. They create internal standards of behavior for the purpose of quality management and the fulfillment of common objectives. Failure to adhere to policy might lead to punishment which is enacted by their organization versus society. Policy is generated by committees, and policy often called upon to resolve procedural quandaries. Issues like MAID, or medical assistance in dying, is an example of a recent policy. Ethical issues can exist in every nurse-patient interaction, as well as interaction with colleagues. Dilemmas are relational in nature. The ethical problem is identified by the individual. The intensity of the problem is variable, therefore can influence the degree to which the person engages in moral behavior. Where there are two possible solutions, neither of which is absolutely acceptable, no obvious solution is apparent, and ethical issues can be examined from multiple lenses. So ethical dilemmas can be simple or they can be complex. We all make difficult decisions in life. Do we move to another town? Should we change jobs? Is this the right time to start my master's program? Some decisions have short-term consequences, whereas others will have long-term consequences. Some questions that we face are more complex and have broader social and professional implications. So the example of MAID, or medical assistance in dying, or human gene research. And some ethical dilemmas are difficult to identify because they seem so common or even mundane. We don't even recognize them as an ethical dilemma. So for example, noticing that a colleague isn't washing their hands after leaving an isolation room. We face various types of ethical problems every day in our nursing practice, medical practice, everyday lives even. So different types of ethical problems could be working on a chronically understaffed unit, speeding in order to take a sick child to the hospital, physically injuring someone in order to restrain them from imminently injuring someone else, not documenting a dressing change, failing to turn a bedridden patient every 2 hours, having one RN and one student nurse do the narcotic count at the end of a shift, reporting questionable nursing practices to the media, gossiping about someone, perhaps making sexist comments, doing vital signs without first asking the patient for their consent, leaving medications at a patient's bedside. In healthcare, we have added complexities that impact our ethical decision-making. Our knowledge in medical science and technology has progressed exponentially since the 17th century. Two major problems have developed alongside this development. First, the inadequate distribution and availability and excessive cost of healthcare. And two, the danger of becoming so infatuated with technology that we cease to question their limitations. Health sciences, though, demands that healthcare practitioners be guided by moral considerations. The role of healthcare ethics is to sensitize or raise consciousness of health professionals concerning ethical issues found in healthcare settings and policies, and structure the issues so that ethically relevant threads of complex situations can be drawn out and discussed. Healthcare ethics addresses four interrelated areas: clinical practice, allocation of scarce resources, human experimentation, and health policy. Healthcare ethics also uses the same virtues, values, and moral principles or rules used in everyday moral considerations. The major difference between healthcare ethics and everyday ethics is that the healthcare ethics occurs in special situations and deals with issues confronting healthcare practitioners. Healthcare ethics is very important. For this course, however, we're going to focus on nursing ethics. The evolution of nursing ethics started in the 1870s, and it made great strides and continues to advance even to this day. So in the 1870s, we had Florence Nightingale, Ethics of Etiquette. From the 1930s to 60s, nurses began to take responsibility of their own practice. 1970s, publications on human rights started to appear. By the end of the 1970s, bioethics was introduced. Influential nurses were publishing using bioethics framework that became the foundation for nursing ethics. And by the end of the 1980s, Fry argued that nursing ethics is separate and distinct from medical ethics. We will be talking more about nursing ethics next week, but for now, let's continue to discuss ethics in a more general way. So why do you think it's important to study ethics? Studying ethics is important for several reasons. The moral terrain. New ethical concerns are developing. Nurses have taken steps to enhance their ethics and practice. Nurses often lead the way to improving healthcare practices, and nurses have a broader understanding or perspective of health. Being ethically fit needs to be developed. Ethics needs to be developed and maintained. It requires being mentally engaged, so thinking, reasoning, grappling with difficult situations on a regular basis. It requires commitment to finding better ways to reach good outcomes. It's about how one prepares to make good choices and take actions that benefit others. It requires nurses to be vigilant about proactively raising questions of value. It requires reflection, involves having conversations, engaging in learning and problem solving. And of course, there's changing nursing roles and responsibilities. Nurses were trained to care for the whole person, but as other healthcare disciplines have emerged, the complete picture of the patient became dotted with holes, even though the nursing's role continues to provide total patient care. In more recent years, because the shift in focus, nurses may not even be aware that one is facing an ethical decision because of the political climate of healthcare. And finally, the context of healthcare and nursing, patient safety, cutbacks, hospital-acquired infections, illnesses, less local governance, task shifting, change in workforce, more unregulated care providers are all impacting ethics, and this is why the study of ethics is important. So what does this all mean for me? So nurses, or you, are moral agents. Because nurses have the capacity to direct their actions to some ethical end, in this case, good outcomes for the patient, they are moral agents. Nurses' commitment to being professionals requires them to use their knowledge and skills for the good of those in their care. Almost every decision they make, for example, which call bell to answer first, how much time will be spent listening to an anxious patient or client when other patients require assistance, are everyday ethical decisions that are made. Being a moral agent means that you are reflective, you have vision, and you have strength. Sometimes, while nurses want to do the right thing, they're pushed to make an ethical decision, but feel that the decision reached has left them feeling compromised in fulfilling their duty of care. Developing a moral community might help address the moral distress experienced by nurses and other healthcare professionals. A moral community is a workplace where values are made clear and are shared, values direct ethical action, and individuals feel safe to be heard. Identifying your own professional and personal values is probably the most important and perhaps most difficult initial step in the process of ethical reasoning. And this is an important part of your weekly assignments that I'll be discussing next week. However, it's absolutely vital to identify and discuss each stakeholder's values and beliefs, including your own, since this work will provide insight into why the issue is an ethical issue and what may or may not be acceptable solutions. Values are the foundation of ethical action. Values versus beliefs. Values are something we hold dear, whereas beliefs are what we think are true. Individual values and beliefs are learned within the context of family, community, and culture. So while nurses bring their own unique set of values and beliefs to the healthcare setting, the expectation is that a nurse's values will be congruent with professional values. Unfortunately, sometimes these don't align, and that there's conflicts in values. And that means that two or more individuals hold different values, calling for actions that cannot both be fulfilled, or when there is a discrepancy between what we value and what we do when these values are called into action. It is here where ethical dilemmas arise. And what you're going to see in the next weeks of the course is every other week you're going to be getting a new case study, and you're going to need to identify what the ethical dilemma is in the case study. You're going to need to look at what the values are at stake for each stakeholder. But again, that will be discussed next week. Given that ethical dilemmas reside at the point where there are conflicts in values, it becomes important to come to know what our values are. So whether it's our personal values or professional values. There are various ways to help clarify our values, and that would include journaling, deliberate reflection, dialoguing with colleagues, and knowing the code of ethics for registered nurses. So here's a comic of Calvin and Hobbes. So take a minute and press pause so that you can read the comic. We probably want to avoid Calvin's experience of dealing with an ethical dilemma, although we might have felt exactly this way at times. Calvin's world literally falls apart when he comes to realize there are multiple ways of viewing the world. For Calvin, this shift in his worldview causes extreme stress, so he simply reverts back to his original position. Although we might not want to be like Calvin, most healthcare professionals aren't prepared to work through ethical dilemmas, even though they need to justify their courses of action. And so, I want to stress the public we serve requires that we justify our courses of action. Most healthcare professionals, including RNs, are not experts in moral philosophy. Ethical issues exist in every clinical practice setting and every interaction with patients and colleagues. And healthcare professionals need to be skilled at ethical decision making so that they can justify their decisions. Consequently, they need to be familiar with some method of moral reasoning. Since healthcare professionals need to justify their course of action when trying to resolve an ethical dilemma, we need to understand what is meant by justification. Justification is based on logic, evidence, careful reflection and persuasive reasons for why the course of action selected is the best course of action given the circumstances. A justification is not an explanation. So, for example, my background leads me to think, behave this way, or a rationalization. This works best for me, so I'll make it sound good. Embedded in justifying courses of action is the selection of a particular ethical framework. So there's top-down, where that would be utilitarianism, deontological, prima facie, bottom-up, feminist, ethic of care, virtue phenomenology, reflective equilibrium, and descriptive versus normative. So over the next 11-12 weeks of this course, we are going to be learning about these different ethical frameworks and applying them to the different case studies that you'll be receiving every other week. Ethical reasoning requires wearing bifocal lenses or looking at things from multiple perspectives and just reflecting on every aspect of the situation. So just really taking apart the situation and looking at it from every perspective possible. So you want to look at it in terms of what are the consequences now? What are the consequences in the future? What are the impact of this locally or globally? Do we need to follow policy? Are there exceptions? Is it better to look at things for the common good? Or do we need to look at things, from the unique priorities or perspective? The logic part of justifying our course of action lies in using a systematic approach to our ethical decision making. One such systematic approach is to use a critical reasoning framework like the one presented on this slide. So what you will see in this course is, as I mentioned before, every other week you'll be getting a case study with an ethical dilemma, and you will need to go through the steps of the critical reasoning framework. So you will be asked to identify what is going on here. What is the ethical issue? And this is the hardest and most important step, is identifying what the issue is. What values do you and the stakeholders have? Who are the stakeholders? What assumptions are you and the stakeholders making? What information exists that will help deepen our knowledge of the issue? So going to the literature, going to policy documents, going to research articles, identifying options for action. And this is an opportunity for you to be creative. Evaluating options and having ethical insights. So best choice justification equals result of process. And acting on the ethical choice and following up, amending mistakes, evaluating, and learning. All of these steps are important, but the next slide is going to focus on the first step of the critical reasoning framework. And this step is particularly important, but one that we might be tempted to review quickly or skip altogether. So the first step is what's going on here. Along with this question is considering who needs to be at the table to resolve the ethical dilemma. So who are the key stakeholders that would be impacted? Values. There are common and divergent values among stakeholders. Points of divergence may illuminate the ethical dilemma. It's important to clarify concepts. Many disputes arise because a term means different things to different people. Agreeing on shared definitions can end many disputes outright and give foundation for more helpful navigation if it's still unresolved. So, for example, euthanasia, is that assisted suicide or murder of an unwilling victim? Or is it about giving control to a person and respecting their wishes for end of life? Probable outcomes, sometimes this is a very difficult question to have. Most often in ethical dilemmas, there's no win-win situations where everyone is happy. That's what makes these types of decisions or situations so difficult. So now I want you to apply the critical reasoning framework to this case study. So this will be an individual reflective activity just to kind of get you thinking about the critical reasoning framework. So a public health nurse is visiting a new mother for her first postpartum home visit. The family lives in what might be considered destitute circumstances. There's little food, there's few toys for the toddler, no running water, etc. The apartment complex really should be condemned. As the visit unfolds and you develop a relationship with the mom, she confesses she doesn't know where the next meal will be coming from. Her toddler has a bowl of cereal, but she hasn't had like really anything else to eat. The baby is being bottle fed using powdered milk. You begin to assess and discuss possible support systems she might access. A knock at the door pulls the mother away for a few minutes. When she comes back, she says she doesn't need any support now, and you're almost certain that there's been a drug deal. So think about that ethical reasoning framework and think about what is actually going on here. What is the ethical issue? What are the different values at stake? Who are the stakeholders? What are the different values? What are the assumptions that you and the stakeholders are making? And see if you can work through that critical reasoning framework, applying it to this case study. And what we can do is, if we have time when we meet synchronously next week, we can discuss your responses. So things that you want to avoid when justifying your course of action are circular arguments. So it's two parts that refer to each other in an infinite loop, providing no real insight or justification. And you also want to avoid begging the question. And that's when an argument's premises assume the truth of a conclusion instead of supporting it. So in other words, you assume without proof the stand or position. Begging the question is also a circular argument. And so an example of begging the question would be like wool sweaters are superior to nylon jackets as fall attire because wool sweaters have the higher wool content. That begs the question because the argument fails to explain why having the higher wool content actually makes the garment more superior. So hopefully that makes sense. In conclusion, ethics helps us deconstruct our notions about events, which moves us towards making the right decision, and the right is in quotation marks. Ethical decision making is really important, and it's required for professional nursing practice. Values are the foundation of ethical action, and step one of the critical reasoning framework is essential. So thanks for listening to this presentation. We will see you at our synchronous session next next week. And again, if you cannot make that synchronous session, I will be recording it and posting it so that you'll have access to what was discussed.